The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, official and stark against our cheerful yellow mailbox. David was humming while flipping pancakes, steam rising from his coffee mug, when I tore open what I assumed was another insurance document. The THAL, Oregon Department of Vital Records seal caught my eye first, then the bold letters across the top. Certificate of death. David Michael Walsh, age 34. Cause of death. Accidental drowning. Date of death. March 15th, 2024. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at the paper, my hands trembling. March 15th was yesterday. David was very much alive, standing 3 feet away from me, completely unaware that according to the state of Oregon, he had drowned in the Columbia River approximately 18 hours ago. The sound of the spatula hitting the floor made me look up. David stood frozen, his face drained of color, staring at the document in my hands. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the sizzle of forgotten pancakes burning in the pan. Amanda? His voice came out as barely a whisper. What does that say? I turned the certificate toward him, watching his eyes scan the official text. David Michael Walsh, born June 12, 1989, died March 15, 2024, in Portland, Oregon. His social security number was correct. His birth date was accurate. Even his middle name, which he rarely used, was spelled perfectly. This has to be a mistake, I said, though something cold was settling in my stomach. As a forensic accountant, I'd learned to trust documentation, and this certificate looked entirely legitimate. The watermarks were correct, the seal was embossed properly, and the signatures appeared genuine. David reached for the paper with shaking hands. Who would even request this? And why? That question would haunt me for the next 6 months as I unraveled the most sophisticated financial fraud I'd ever encountered, one that required my husband to be legally dead while very much alive. I had met David Walsh 3 years earlier at a community college fundraiser in Southeast Portland. He was volunteering for the environmental science program, passionate about sustainable forestry practices, and completely unaware that he was heir to one of Oregon's largest timber fortunes. The Thornfield family had built their empire on old-growth logging, a legacy that David's late father had tried to reform before his sudden death in a hiking accident when David was 12. What I didn't know then was that David's Aunt Margaret had spent the last 22 years systematically conditioning him to never question family business decisions, never access his trust fund, and never marry anyone who might investigate the Thornfield financial empire. My expertise in forensic accounting made me exactly the kind of threat she'd spent decades preparing to eliminate. The morning the death certificate arrived, I was already running late for a client meeting downtown. Hastings and Associates had hired me to investigate discrepancies in their pension fund, the kind of detailed financial detective work that had built my reputation in Portland's business community. I'd planned to review David's breakfast creation, kiss him goodbye, and drive my reliable Honda to the office like any other Tuesday. Instead, I found myself calling in sick while David sat at our kitchen table, staring at his own death certificate with the kind of confused expression I'd been documenting in my private notes for months. The vacant look that appeared after family, phone calls, the way he'd suddenly change his mind about major decisions without explanation, the headaches that followed any mention of accessing his inheritance. We need to call the Vital Records office, I said, already reaching for my phone. This is obviously an error. David nodded absently, but something in his posture had shifted. He'd gone rigid in the particular way I'd learned to recognize, like a computer program running a background process. Actually, he said slowly, maybe we should call Aunt Margaret first. She handles all the family paperwork. The suggestion made no sense. Why would his aunt in Portland Heights know anything about a state-issued death certificate? But David was already dialing her number, with the automatic precision of someone following a script. I listened to his side of the conversation, noting how his language patterns changed when speaking to Margaret Thornfield. Shorter sentences, deferential tone, the same vocal shifts I'd observed during their monthly dinners at her estate. "She says it's probably identity theft," David reported after hanging up. "Someone might be trying to access my accounts or benefits. She's going to have the family lawyer look into it." Every instinct I'd developed as a forensic accountant was screaming warnings. Identity thieves didn't forge death certificates. They typically worked with stolen Social Security numbers and credit applications. A death certificate was a tool for inheritance claims, life insurance payouts, or property transfers. Someone wanted David legally dead for a very specific financial reason. I spent the rest of that Tuesday morning researching death certificate procedures while David returned to his usual routine with unsettling normalcy. By lunch, I'd learned that requesting someone else's death certificate required specific legal standing: immediate family members, legal representatives, or persons with a direct financial interest in the estate. The certificate had been requested by Margaret Thornfield in her capacity as trustee of the David Walsh Memorial Trust. A trust I'd never heard of, established apparently the day after David's supposed death. That afternoon, while David attended his environmental consulting job at a nonprofit downtown, I drove to the Multnomah County Records Office. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Patricia, confirmed that the death certificate was legitimate as far as their system showed. "The physician who signed the death certificate is Dr. Harrison Blake," she told me, reading from her computer screen. "He's listed as attending physician at Portland General." I thanked Patricia and immediately drove to Portland General Hospital. Dr. Blake was indeed on staff, specializing in emergency medicine. When I asked to speak with him about the David Walsh death certificate, his assistant informed me that Dr. Blake was currently on a month-long vacation in Europe. The pieces were forming a picture I didn't want to see. Someone with access to legitimate medical credentials had filed a false death certificate. Someone with legal authority had established a memorial trust. Someone was moving David's assets, while he made pancakes and went to work and lived his life completely unaware that he was supposedly dead. That evening, I suggested we review our financial accounts together, something we hadn't done in months. David seemed uncomfortable with the idea, claiming he trusted me to handle our finances. When I pressed, he developed one of his sudden headaches and went to bed early. I stayed up until 2 in the morning, accessing every account I could find. Our joint checking showed normal activity. Our savings appeared untouched. But when I tried to log into David's individual accounts, I discovered that his access had been suspended due to account holder death notification. Thornfield Industries had frozen David's trust fund the morning his death certificate was filed. Nearly $2 million held in stasis while the Memorial Trust processed what appeared to be a legitimate inheritance transfer. I realized I was looking at a nearly perfect crime. David was alive, unaware, and legally dead. His assets were being transferred through proper channels using authentic documentation. Unless someone could prove the death certificate was fraudulent, the theft would appear entirely legitimate. But forensic accounting had taught me that every financial crime leaves traces. Margaret Thornfield might have created a masterpiece of legal fiction, but she'd also created a paper trail. Over the next several weeks, I would follow that trail through Portland's elite social networks, discovering a web of corruption that extended far beyond simple inheritance theft. The first clue came from an unexpected source. While researching Dr. Blake's credentials, I discovered that he'd attended medical school with a substantial scholarship from the Thornfield Foundation. A scholarship that continued through his residency and was recently renewed for continuing education, despite Blake being 15 years out of medical school. The Thornfield Foundation's tax filings showed a pattern of supporting professionals, who might later prove useful: doctors, lawyers, judges, insurance executives. Margaret Haddon Thornfield wasn't just stealing David's inheritance. She'd spent decades building a network of indebted professionals who could provide services when needed. I began keeping detailed records of David's behavior patterns, noting how certain phone calls or conversations would trigger dramatic personality shifts. After speaking with his aunt, he'd become suddenly agreeable to decisions he'd previously opposed. Family dinners left him listless and compliant for days afterward. My background in forensic accounting proved invaluable for documenting these patterns. I created spreadsheets tracking his behavioral changes, cross-referenced with family contact, and began recording conversations with a small device I purchased at an electronics store in Beaverton. 3 weeks after the death certificate arrived, David announced that he'd decided to take a leave of absence from his job to figure things out. The decision seemed to come from nowhere, but I'd learned to trace his sudden choices back to family influence. "Aunt Margaret thinks it would be good for me to spend some time at the family cabin," he explained over dinner. "Clear my head. Maybe do some hiking." The family cabin was a remote property near Mount Hood, hours from cell phone service. If David disappeared there, even temporarily, it would give Margaret time to complete whatever financial transfers she had planned. I agreed enthusiastically, suggesting we make it a romantic getaway. Margaret's plan required David to be isolated, not accompanied by a forensic accountant with questions about his supposed death. That night, while David slept, I photographed every document in his home office: bank statements, insurance policies, correspondence with family lawyers. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. David had been signing papers for months without understanding their implications. Powers of attorney, trust modifications, beneficiary changes. All changes that would be activated upon his death. Margaret Thornfield had been preparing for David's demise for years, conditioning him to sign documents without question while building a network of professionals who could make his death appear natural and legal. The only flaw in her plan was that David remained stubbornly, inconveniently alive. But I was beginning to understand that his continued existence was temporary. The death certificate wasn't just about stealing money, it was preparation for making the fiction become reality. Over the following days, I noticed David's headaches becoming more severe. He complained of dizziness, nausea, and memory problems. When I suggested seeing a doctor, he insisted it was just stress, and that Aunt Margaret had recommended a specialist who could help. The specialist was Dr. Harrison Blake, supposedly vacationing in Europe, but apparently available for private consultations with family friends. The same doctor who had signed David's death certificate was now offering to treat the very much alive David Walsh for mysterious neurological symptoms. I realized that Margaret's plan was evolving. If she couldn't wait for David to die naturally, she would arrange for his death to match the certificate she'd already filed. An accidental drowning would be difficult to investigate if David's body showed evidence of the neurological condition that Dr. Blake was supposedly treating. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was when I made the decision that would define the next phase of my life. Instead of confronting David directly or going to the police with incomplete evidence, I would do what I did best: build an airtight case using financial documentation, recorded evidence, and professional expertise. Margaret Thornfield had spent years planning the perfect inheritance theft. I would spend the next several months planning her perfect exposure. But first, I needed to keep David alive long enough to see justice served. The next morning, I called in sick to work again and drove to the Oregon State Library to begin my real investigation. As a forensic accountant, I knew that sophisticated financial crimes always involved multiple layers of documentation, and Margaret Thornfield had been operating for decades. If I was going to expose her scheme, I needed to understand the full scope of her network. I started with public records, searching for every business entity connected to the Thornfield name. What I discovered was a maze of interconnected companies, foundations, and trusts spanning back 40 years. Thornfield Industries was just the visible tip of an iceberg that included timber holdings across 3 states, real estate investments, and charitable foundations that seemed designed more for tax avoidance than philanthropy. The Thornfield Foundation's tax returns painted a picture of strategic relationship building. Dr. Harrison Blake wasn't the only professional receiving ongoing financial support. Judge Patricia Moreau, who had handled several Thornfield legal matters, had received speaking fees for foundation events. Detective Ray Morrison, who would likely investigate any suspicious deaths in Portland, had been awarded a foundation scholarship for his daughter's medical school tuition. Margaret had spent decades cultivating obligations among people who could prove useful. A doctor to sign death certificates, a judge to expedite probate proceedings, a detective to minimize investigation into family deaths. The network was elegant in its corruption and terrifying in its scope. I cross-referenced the dates of these payments with family deaths and found a pattern that made my blood run cold. David's father, Michael Walsh, had died in a hiking accident 12 years earlier. The accident had been investigated by Detective Morrison, ruled accidental by Judge Moreau, and the death certificate had been signed by Dr. Blake, who was fresh, out of residency and recently awarded his Thornfield Foundation scholarship. Margaret hadn't started planning David's death recently. She'd been eliminating potential heirs for decades, using the same network of corrupted professionals to make each death appear natural and unquestionable. I spent the afternoon at the Portland City Archives researching the circumstances of Michael Walsh's death. The police report was brief and conclusory. Experienced hiker found at the bottom of a cliff along the Eagle Creek Trail, likely fell while taking photographs. No witnesses, no suspicious circumstances, case closed within a week. But the insurance records told a different story. Michael Walsh had increased his life insurance policy 6 months before his death, naming Margaret Thornfield as trustee for David's inheritance. The premium payments had been made by the Thornfield Foundation as part of a family financial planning initiative. Michael Walsh hadn't just died in a convenient accident. He'd been systematically prepared for death, just like David was being. Prepared now. Margaret had been refining this scheme for over a decade, learning from each success and eliminating any potential flaws. That evening, I returned home to find David packing for his trip to the family cabin. His movements were mechanical, like someone following instructions rather than making personal choices. When I asked about the duration of the trip, he seemed uncertain. "Aunt Margaret thinks I should stay as long as needed," he said, folding clothes with unusual precision. "Until I feel more centered." I suggested joining him for the weekend, but he became agitated at the idea. Dr. Blake had supposedly recommended solitude for David's condition, and Margaret thought my presence might interfere with his healing process. Everything about the conversation felt scripted. David was repeating phrases that sounded like Margaret's words, rather than expressing his own thoughts. The conditioning I'd observed over months was accelerating, his personality becoming increasingly subsumed by his aunt's directives. I helped him pack while mentally planning my own investigation. If David was going to be isolated at the cabin, this might be my only opportunity to gather evidence from Margaret's estate in Portland Heights. More importantly, I needed to understand the timeline of her plan. How long did I have before David's death certificate became reality? The next morning, I kissed David goodbye and watched him drive toward Mount Hood in his blue Honda Civic. As soon as his car disappeared, I called my assistant at work and arranged for extended sick leave. Officially, I was dealing with a family emergency. Unofficially, I was about to commit several crimes in service of preventing a murder. Margaret Thornfield lived in a sprawling Tudor-style mansion in Portland Heights, the kind of old money estate that signaled generational wealth and social prominence. I'd been there numerous times for family dinners, but always as David's wife, never as an investigator looking for evidence of criminal enterprise. I spent 2 days conducting surveillance, learning the household routines. Margaret employed a housekeeper who arrived at 9 and left at 3, a gardener who worked Tuesdays and Fridays, and a private secretary who visited weekly to handle correspondence. Security appeared minimal, consisting mainly of a standard alarm system and a few decorative cameras. On Thursday afternoon, I put my plan into action. I called Margaret's landline from a burner phone, claiming to be from Portland General Hospital with urgent information about Dr. Blake's European consultation. Regarding David's condition, the call was designed to lure her away from the house and create urgency around David's medical situation. While Margaret rushed to the hospital for a non-existent appointment, I entered her estate through a side door I'd observed the housekeeper using. My hands shook as I disabled the alarm using a code I'd watched Margaret input during a previous visit, but my forensic training kicked in as soon as I was inside. Margaret's home office was a monument to organized control. Filing cabinets lined the walls, labeled with precise categories: medical professionals, legal contacts, insurance matters, family trust documents. I photographed everything I could reach, using a high-resolution camera to capture details I could examine later. In a locked drawer that I opened with tools purchased from a locksmith supply company, I found the smoking gun I'd been seeking. A leather portfolio labeled David Walsh Transition Plan contained a complete timeline for his elimination. The documents inside read like a project management plan for murder. Phase 1 involved conditioning David to sign legal documents without question, completed over the past 2 years. Phase 2 required isolating him from potential witnesses and support systems currently in progress. Phase 3 would involve inducing the neurological symptoms that Dr. Blake would treat with medications that would ultimately cause the accidental drowning described in his death certificate. The timeline showed David had approximately 3 weeks to live. Margaret had documented everything with businesslike precision. David's medications would cause disorientation and loss of motor control. Dr. Blake would recommend therapeutic activities near water, where David's compromised coordination would lead to a tragic but explainable accident. The death would match the certificate already filed, creating a seamless narrative of misfortune rather than murder. I photographed every page, my hands steadier now with the focus that came from absolute clarity of purpose. Margaret Thornfield wasn't just a thief. She was a serial killer who had turned family elimination into a sophisticated business process. The final section of the portfolio detailed the financial aftermath. David's assets would flow through the Memorial Trust to Margaret's control, adding approximately $2 million to her already substantial wealth. But the money seemed secondary to the satisfaction of absolute control. Her notes included observations about David's compliance during conditioning sessions, rating his responses like a behavioral scientist studying lab animals. I was photographing the last pages when I heard a car in the driveway. Margaret had returned from her futile trip to the hospital, undoubtedly suspicious about the fake call. I quickly replaced the documents, relocked the drawer, and exited through the same side door I'd used for entry. From my car parked down the street, I watched Margaret examine her home with the careful attention of someone checking for intruders. She spent several minutes in her office, but my evidence gathering had been careful enough to avoid detection. As far as she knew, her plan remained secret and on schedule. That night, I reviewed the photographs on my laptop, building a comprehensive case file that documented Margaret's criminal enterprise. But I faced a crucial problem. Nearly all of my evidence had been obtained through illegal search and could never be used in court. I needed to find a way to expose Margaret's plan using only legally obtained information. I also needed to protect David without revealing my investigation. If he knew about Margaret's plan, his behavioral changes might alert her that someone was interfering. But if I did nothing, he would die within weeks according to the timeline I'd discovered. I decided on a two-pronged approach. First, I would continue gathering legally admissible evidence by focusing on the financial records I could access through legitimate channels. Second, I would subtly interfere with Margaret's timeline by creating delays and complications that might buy David more time. I started with the bank records. As David's wife, I had legitimate access to our joint accounts and could request information about transactions that affected our shared finances. I discovered that David had been making Regular payments to something called Wellness Solutions Northwest, a company that didn't appear in any business directories. Further investigation revealed that Wellness Solutions Northwest was Dr. Blake's private consulting practice, the entity through which he provided the specialized neurological treatments that Margaret had recommended for David. The payments had started the week David began experiencing headaches, confirming that his symptoms were being artificially induced. I also found evidence of the medication regimen David was following. His insurance claims showed prescriptions for what appeared to be legitimate neurological medications, but my research into their side effects revealed a dangerous combination. Taken together, the medications would cause exactly the disorientation and motor control problems that would lead to accidental drowning. With this legally obtained evidence, I began building a case I could present to law enforcement. But I knew that stopping Margaret would require more than just exposing her current plan. She had killed before and would kill again if she escaped consequences for David's attempted murder. I needed to create a situation where Margaret would reveal her entire criminal operation, preferably with witnesses present and evidence that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed. The solution came to me while reviewing her foundation's upcoming events calendar. The Thornfield Foundation was hosting its annual Donor Appreciation Gala in 2 weeks, an elegant affair attended by Portland's social and political elite. Margaret would be surrounded by the very professionals she had corrupted over the decades, all gathered to celebrate her charitable contributions to the community. If I could manipulate circumstances to reveal the truth at the gala, Margaret's entire network would be exposed simultaneously. Her corrupted professionals would become witnesses to their own complicity, and the social pressure would prevent any coordinated cover-up. But first, I needed to ensure David survived long enough to see justice served. His isolation at the cabin was playing directly into Margaret's timeline, but bringing him home prematurely might accelerate her plan. I decided on a different approach. If David was going to be at the remote cabin, I would join him there, but not as his concerned wife. I would arrive as backup he didn't know he needed, positioning myself to interfere with any attempt on his life while maintaining the appearance of a spontaneous visit. I spent the weekend preparing for what might be the most dangerous phase of my investigation. Margaret had killed David's father and successfully covered it up for over a decade. She had corrupted law enforcement, medical professionals, and judicial officials to serve her purposes. She was operating with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for her actions. But she had never dealt with someone who understood financial crime from the inside, someone who could see the patterns she thought were invisible. Margaret Thornfield had created a perfect system for eliminating family members and stealing their assets. I was about to turn that system against her. Monday morning, I loaded my car with camping gear and drove toward Mount Hood, following the same route David had taken days earlier. The family cabin was isolated enough that cell phone service was intermittent, but I'd come prepared with satellite communication equipment and GPS tracking devices. More importantly, I'd come armed with knowledge of Margaret's complete plan and the evidence to destroy her criminal empire. The next phase of my investigation would be the most dangerous, but also the most crucial. David's life depended on my ability to outsmart a woman who had been perfecting murder for decades. But as I drove through the mountain forests toward our confrontation, I felt the cold satisfaction of a forensic accountant who had finally found the discrepancy that would unravel everything. The family cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs, its rustic exterior masking the sophisticated surveillance system I spotted within minutes of arrival. Margaret had chosen this location carefully, remote enough to eliminate witnesses, but equipped with monitoring technology that would document David's final days for her records. I parked my Honda behind a cluster of trees half a mile down the access road, then approached the cabin on foot through the forest. David's blue Civic was parked in the main clearing, and I could see him through the large windows, moving around the kitchen with the same mechanical precision I'd observed at home. Through binoculars, I watched his routine unfold over several hours. David prepared meals at exact times, took medication from a daily pill organizer, and spent long periods sitting motionless in a chair facing the lake. His behavior had all the hallmarks of someone following a strict regimen designed to look like natural recovery, while actually preparing his body for the final phase of Margaret's plan. The cabin's isolation was more complete than I'd anticipated. No cell service, no internet, no telephone landline. If something happened to David here, it would be hours before anyone could summon help, and by then, Margaret's carefully crafted accident would be complete. I established my own surveillance position in an abandoned hunting blind approximately 200 yards from the cabin, with clear sight lines to the building and the lake beyond. From here, I could monitor David's activities while remaining invisible to Margaret's security cameras. Over the next 2 days, I documented David's declining condition with growing alarm. His coordination was noticeably deteriorating, and he frequently paused during simple tasks as if fighting dizziness or confusion. The medications Dr. Blake had prescribed were working exactly as Margaret intended, systematically compromising David's ability to function safely around water. On Wednesday afternoon, David received his first visitor. A black SUV arrived carrying Dr. Blake, who was supposedly still vacationing in Europe. I photographed his license plate and used a telephoto lens to capture images of him entering the cabin with a medical bag and what appeared to be additional medications. Through the cabin windows, I watched Blake examine David with clinical detachment, checking his reflexes, balance, and coordination. The doctor took extensive notes, documenting the progression of symptoms he was artificially inducing. At one point, Blake made a phone call and I could see him nodding and smiling, clearly reporting successful progress to someone who wasn't visible in my field of view. After Blake left, David's condition visibly worsened. He stumbled while walking and had to steady himself against furniture. When he attempted to prepare dinner, he dropped a plate and spent several minutes staring at the broken pieces as if unable to understand what had happened. I realized Margaret's timeline was accelerating. David's neurological impairment had reached the level where an accidental drowning would be believable. The next phase of her plan would begin soon, and I needed to be ready to intervene without revealing my presence. That night, I used my satellite communication device to upload the evidence I'd gathered to a secure cloud server. If something happened to me at the cabin, the documentation of Margaret's crimes would still reach the appropriate authorities. I also sent encrypted messages to 3 journalists I'd researched, providing them with preliminary information and instructions to investigate further if they didn't hear from me within a week. Thursday morning brought Margaret herself, arriving in a silver Mercedes with tinted windows. I watched through binoculars as she embraced David with theatrical affection, playing the role of concerned aunt while actually preparing for his murder. Margaret spent the day walking David around the property, pointing out features of the landscape with particular attention to the lake's shoreline. She showed him the wooden dock, the swimming area, and the scenic overlook where David's father had supposedly taken his last photographs before falling to his death. Their conversation was too distant for me to hear clearly, but Margaret's body language suggested careful coaching. She was programming David's final activities, establishing the routine that would lead to his carefully orchestrated accident. That evening, I moved closer to the cabin, using the forest shadows to position myself near enough to hear their dinner conversation. Margaret's voice carried through the open windows as she discussed David's therapeutic progress with Dr. Blake, who had returned for what she called a final consultation. "The morning swims have been particularly beneficial," Margaret was saying, her tone warm and encouraging. Dr. Blake agrees that the combination of cold water therapy and medication is exactly what David needs for his neurological recovery. Blake nodded professionally, making notes in his file. "The early morning hours are optimal," he confirmed. "The cooler temperatures enhance the therapeutic effect of the treatment regimen. I recommend starting tomorrow at dawn, approximately 6 a.m. David's response was sluggish and compliant. "If you think it will help with the headaches and dizziness." "Absolutely," Blake assured him. Many patients experience complete resolution of symptoms after this type of intensive therapy. I felt sick listening to them plan David's death with such clinical precision. They were scheduling his drowning like a medical appointment, discussing the optimal conditions for making murder look like therapeutic accident. After Blake left for the evening, Margaret spent another hour with David, reviewing what she called his morning routine. Through the windows, I could see her drawing diagrams and making lists, ensuring David understood exactly what he was supposed to do when he woke up. The important thing is consistency, Margaret emphasized. Same time, same location, same approach. Dr. Blake's research shows that therapeutic routine is crucial for neurological healing. David nodded obediently, already looking drowsy from his evening medications. Margaret helped him prepare for bed with unusual attentiveness, checking that his alarm was set for 5:30 a.m. and laying out clothes for his morning swim. She kissed his forehead goodnight like a caring relative, then settled into the guest bedroom, as if planning to sleep peacefully while her nephew prepared for his final morning. I spent that night in the hunting blind, using night vision equipment to monitor the cabin while planning my intervention. Margaret's scheme was elegant in its simplicity. David would wake up disoriented from medications, follow his programmed routine to the lake, and lose his coordination in the cold water. By the time Margaret discovered his body, it would appear that he had suffered a tragic accident during his therapeutic swimming routine. Dr. Blake would examine the body and confirm that David's neurological condition had caused the disorientation that led to drowning. The death certificate Blake had already filed would match the circumstances perfectly. Margaret would inherit David's assets through the memorial trust she'd established, completing a murder that had been planned and documented like a business transaction. But Margaret had made one crucial error in her planning. She had underestimated the determination of a forensic accountant who had seen through her scheme and positioned herself to intervene at the critical moment. At 5:15 a.m., I watched David's alarm go off through the cabin windows. He moved with the mechanical compliance I'd observed throughout his stay, dressing in the clothes Margaret had selected and taking his morning medications without question. Margaret remained in her bedroom, maintaining the fiction that she was unaware of David's therapeutic routine. Through thermal imaging, I could see her awake and alert, monitoring his movements while pretending to sleep. David emerged from the cabin at 5:45, walking slowly toward the lake with a towel draped over his shoulder. His gait was unsteady, and he paused frequently to maintain his balance. The medications had achieved their intended effect, compromising his coordination while leaving him conscious enough to follow the routine Margaret had programmed into him. I moved through the forest parallel to his path, staying close enough to intervene while remaining invisible to Margaret's surveillance cameras. David reached the dock and began removing his shirt with fumbling movements, nearly losing his balance twice in the process. The lake water was shockingly cold, fed by mountain streams that maintained near-freezing temperatures even in summer. For someone in David's medicated condition, immersion in that water would cause immediate disorientation and rapid loss of motor control. David sat on the edge of the dock, dangling his feet in the water and wincing at the temperature. He looked confused and uncertain, as if his programmed instructions were conflicting with his survival instincts. I realized this was the moment Margaret had planned so carefully. David would enter the water voluntarily, following Dr. Blake's therapeutic recommendations, but his compromised neurological state would prevent him from swimming effectively or calling for help. Through my binoculars, I could see Margaret watching from her bedroom window, ready to discover David's body at the appropriate time and call for emergency assistance that would arrive too late to save him. David lowered himself into the water, with agonizing slowness, gasping as the cold shocked his system. The medications made him clumsy and confused, but they hadn't completely eliminated his awareness that something was wrong. He tried to swim toward the center of the lake, following Margaret's therapeutic instructions, but his strokes were uncoordinated and ineffective. Within minutes, He was struggling to keep his head above water, his movements becoming increasingly panicked as the cold and medication effects overwhelmed his ability to function. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the critical point where Margaret's plan would succeed unless someone intervened. I had documented her crimes, gathered evidence of her systematic murder scheme, and positioned myself to save David's life while exposing her entire operation. But rescuing David would only be the beginning. Margaret had spent decades perfecting this system of family elimination, corrupting officials and professionals to serve her purposes. Stopping her would require more than just preventing David's death. It would require destroying her entire criminal network. I made my decision and moved toward the lake, ready to turn Margaret Thornfield's perfect murder plan into the evidence that would finally bring her to justice. But first, I had to save my husband's life. David was 20 feet from shore when his coordination completely failed. The combination of cold water and neurological medications had created exactly the circumstances Margaret intended, leaving him unable to swim effectively or call for help. I entered the water from a position hidden from the cabin's surveillance, cameras, swimming underwater until I could reach David without being detected. His panic made the rescue more difficult, but my adrenaline and determination overcame the shocking cold of the mountain lake. I managed to keep both of us afloat, while swimming toward a section of shoreline that couldn't be observed from Margaret's bedroom window. David was semi-conscious and hypothermic, his lips blue and his coordination completely compromised by the medication cocktail Dr. Blake had prescribed. Getting David to safety was only the first phase of my plan. Now I needed to create the appearance that Margaret's scheme had succeeded while actually gathering the evidence that would expose her entire operation. I helped David to a hiding spot in the forest, wrapping him in emergency blankets I'd brought from my surveillance equipment. He was too disoriented to understand what was happening, but his vital signs were stable, and the immediate danger had passed. The real challenge was about to begin. Margaret would soon discover that David was missing from the lake, and her reaction would provide the final evidence I needed to prove premeditated murder. I positioned my cameras to record her response, then returned to my hiding spot to wait for the performance that would finally reveal Margaret Thornfield's true nature to the world. At 6:30 a.m., Margaret emerged from the cabin dressed in a silk robe and slippers, carrying a coffee mug, and wearing an expression of calculated concern. I watched through my telephoto lens as she walked to the lake's edge, calling David's name with just the right amount of worry in her voice. She spent several minutes scanning the water's surface, shading her eyes against the morning sun and calling out repeatedly. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, a masterpiece of feigned panic that would have convinced any witness of her genuine distress over her missing nephew. What Margaret didn't know was that every moment of her act was being recorded by high-definition cameras I had positioned throughout the area. Her reaction to David's apparent drowning would provide the final piece of evidence proving premeditated murder. After locating David's towel and clothes on the dock, Margaret's demeanor shifted slightly. The concern remained, but underneath it I could detect satisfaction, the look of someone whose carefully laid plans were proceeding exactly as intended. She returned to the cabin and made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones that my directional microphone captured clearly. "It's happened," she said simply. "David went for his morning swim and didn't come back. Yes, exactly as we discussed. Dr. Blake's assessment was correct about the timeline." The person on the other end of the call spoke briefly, and Margaret nodded with visible relief. "I'll wait exactly 30 minutes before calling emergency services. We need it to look like I just woke up and discovered he was missing." Margaret spent those 30 minutes preparing her story, rehearsing the emotional reactions she would display for the responding officers. She made herself appear disheveled, mussed her hair, and even managed to produce tears on command. The transformation from calculating killer to grieving aunt was both impressive and horrifying. At 7 a.m. precisely, Margaret called 911 from the cabin's landline, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated distress. "My nephew is missing," she sobbed into the phone. "He went swimming this morning and I can't find him anywhere. Please send help immediately." The dispatcher's questions elicited a stream of carefully prepared responses. David had been staying at the cabin for therapeutic reasons, suffering from neurological symptoms that affected his balance and coordination. Dr. Blake had recommended swimming therapy, but the cold mountain lake was dangerous for someone in David's condition. Margaret painted a picture of a tragic accident waiting to happen, a vulnerable young man whose medical condition had led to an inevitable drowning. Every detail supported the narrative she and Dr. Blake had constructed, creating a story that would satisfy investigators and close the case quickly. Within 20 minutes, I could hear sirens echoing through the mountain valleys. The emergency response team included paramedics, sheriff's deputies, and a dive recovery unit equipped to search the lake's depths for David's body. Detective Ray Morrison led the investigation, the same officer who had investigated David's father's death 12 years earlier. His presence confirmed that Margaret's network of corrupted officials extended to the highest levels of local law enforcement. I watched Morrison interview Margaret with the thoroughness of someone going through the motions rather than conducting a genuine investigation. His questions were perfunctory, designed to establish the basic facts for his report rather than probe for inconsistencies or suspicious circumstances. Margaret's answers flowed smoothly, each response supporting the accidental drowning narrative. She described David's deteriorating condition, his commitment to following Dr. Blake's therapeutic recommendations, and her own deep concern about his safety near the water. "I should have insisted he wait for supervision," she told Morrison, with convincing anguish. But Dr. Blake said the independence was important for his recovery. David was so determined to get better. Morrison nodded sympathetically, making notes that would form the foundation of his incident report. The investigation was proceeding exactly as Margaret intended, with no serious scrutiny of the circumstances or timeline. The dive team spent 3 hours searching the lake while Margaret maintained her grieving aunt performance for the assembled emergency responders. She provided coffee and sandwiches, shared stories about David's childhood, and displayed exactly the right combination of hope and despair. When the divers failed to locate David's body, Morrison assured Margaret that mountain lakes often held their victims for weeks or months before releasing them. The cold water and underwater currents could carry a drowning victim far from the point of entry, making immediate recovery unlikely. Margaret accepted this explanation with resigned sadness, asking when she should expect to recover David's remains for burial. Morrison estimated it could take anywhere from days to months, depending on water conditions and seasonal changes. This timeline played perfectly into Margaret's financial plans. David's death certificate was already filed, his trust fund frozen, and his assets ready for transfer. Whether or not his body was immediately recovered, Margaret could proceed with claiming his inheritance through legal channels that were already in motion. After the emergency responders departed, Margaret spent the afternoon making phone calls to family members, lawyers, and insurance companies. I recorded every conversation, documenting her systematic activation of the systems she had spent years putting in place. Her call to the insurance company was particularly revealing. She reported David's disappearance with clinical precision, providing policy numbers and claim forms as if she had prepared for this conversation months in advance. "The death certificate has already been filed with the state," she told the insurance representative. Dr. Harrison Blake was the attending physician. Detective Morrison is handling the investigation, case number 2024, MT 1847. The efficiency of her responses demonstrated how thoroughly Margaret had prepared for this moment. Every official she needed to contact had been cultivated as part of her network. Every document required for David's legal death had been prepared in advance. But Margaret's greatest strength was also her fatal weakness. Her compulsive need to document and control every aspect of her schemes had created a comprehensive record of premeditated murder. While Margaret believed she was executing the perfect crime, I was gathering evidence that would destroy her entire operation. Every phone call, every conversation with officials, every calculated emotion was being recorded and preserved for the prosecution that would follow. As evening approached, Margaret prepared to return to Portland, confident that David's death would be ruled accidental and his inheritance would flow smoothly into her control. She packed her belongings with satisfaction, humming softly as she prepared to leave the scene of what she believed was her perfect crime. But before departing, Margaret made one final phone call that would provide the most damning evidence of her guilt. Dr. Blake answered on the first ring, clearly expecting her call. "Phase 3 complete," Margaret reported with businesslike satisfaction. "David's body hasn't been recovered yet, but Morrison confirms the lake typically holds victims for extended periods. We have plenty of time for the financial transfers." Blake's response was equally clinical. "Excellent. The medication regimen achieved exactly the neurological impairment we projected. The timeline from therapeutic swimming to accidental drowning was optimal." They spent 10 minutes reviewing the logistics of David's legal death, discussing insurance, payouts, trust fund transfers, and the memorial service Margaret was already planning. Their conversation read like a post-project review meeting, analyzing the success of their murder scheme with professional detachment. Margaret concluded the call with instructions for Blake to prepare documentation supporting David's accidental death ruling. As the attending physician who had treated David's neurological condition, Blake's medical opinion would carry significant weight with the coroner's office. After Margaret departed, I waited until her car was completely out of sight before retrieving David from his hiding place in the forest. He was conscious but disoriented, the medication effects gradually wearing off as his body temperature returned to normal. David's confusion was heartbreaking to witness. He remembered waking up at the cabin and following his morning routine, but everything after entering the lake was a blur of cold water and panic. He had no memory of my rescue or the hours spent hidden in the forest. "What happened to me?" he asked repeatedly, touching his head as if trying to locate missing memories. "I was swimming, and then everything went dark. How did I get here?" I helped David into warm clothes and explained that he had nearly drowned due to an adverse reaction to his medications. For now, I kept the explanation simple, focusing on his immediate safety rather than revealing the full scope of Margaret's murder plot. The most challenging aspect of our situation was maintaining the fiction of David's death while preparing to expose Margaret's crimes. If David appeared alive too soon, Margaret would realize her plan had failed and potentially eliminate both of us to protect her secret. I needed David to remain officially dead until I could present the complete evidence package to authorities who weren't part of Margaret's corrupted network. This meant keeping him hidden while building a case strong enough to overcome decades of official complicity. Using my satellite communication device, I contacted FBI agent Jennifer Torres, a federal investigator who specialized in financial crimes and public corruption. Torres worked out of the Portland field office, but had no connections to local law enforcement that Margaret might have compromised. I transmitted an encrypted summary of my evidence along with audio recordings of Margaret's phone calls and video footage of her performance for the local investigators. Torres responded within hours, confirming that a federal task force would take jurisdiction over the case based on the interstate financial crimes I had documented. The next phase of my plan required careful coordination with federal authorities while maintaining the appearance that David's death investigation was proceeding normally. Margaret needed to believe her scheme had succeeded until the moment federal agents arrived with arrest warrants. I spent 2 days preparing David for what would be the most challenging performance of his life. When we revealed his survival, it would trigger a confrontation that would expose Margaret's entire criminal network, but it would also put both of us at significant risk. Margaret had killed before, and would certainly kill again if she realized her decades of planning were unraveling. The federal agents would provide protection, but only if we could survive long enough to testify against her. David's understanding of the situation evolved gradually as the medication effects completely cleared and his memories began returning. The programming Margaret had used to control him for years was breaking down, allowing him to see clearly, for the first time since childhood. "She killed my father," he said quietly as we reviewed the evidence I had gathered. The hiking accident, the convenient timing, the way she took control of everything afterward. It was all planned. David's anger was a healthy sign that his authentic personality was emerging from beneath the layers of conditioning Margaret had imposed, but his emotional recovery would have to wait until we had ensured his physical survival. On Friday morning, I received confirmation that the federal task force was ready to move. Agent Torres had assembled a team of investigators who would simultaneously arrest Margaret, Dr. Blake, Detective Morrison, and Judge Moreau, based on the evidence I had provided. The arrests would be coordinated with David's dramatic reappearance, creating a media spectacle that would make it impossible for Margaret's remaining allies to suppress or dismiss the charges against her. But first, I needed to position David and myself for the confrontation that would expose 30 years of corruption and murder in Portland's most exclusive social circles. Margaret's Foundation Gala was scheduled for Saturday evening at the Columbia River Club, bringing together everyone who had enabled her crimes in one location. It was the perfect venue for revealing the truth about the Thornfield family's criminal empire. I spent Friday afternoon preparing recording equipment and coordination plans with the federal task force. Saturday evening would determine whether justice would finally prevail, or whether Margaret's network of corruption would find a way to silence us permanently. David was ready to face his aunt and reclaim his life. I was ready to present the evidence that would destroy her criminal organization. But Margaret Thornfield had survived decades of scrutiny through careful planning and ruthless elimination of threats. The final confrontation would test every skill I had developed as a forensic accountant and every ounce of courage I possessed as someone fighting for justice. Margaret's perfect system was about to face its first serious challenge, and only one of us would survive the encounter. The Columbia River Club gleamed like a jewel against Portland's skyline, its neoclassical architecture housing an evening that would reshape the city's power structure forever. Margaret Thornfield had chosen this venue for her foundation's annual gala precisely because it represented everything she valued: exclusivity, tradition, and the kind of old money prestige that made people reluctant to ask uncomfortable questions. Tonight, those same qualities would work against her. I arrived early, having spent the afternoon coordinating final details with Agent Torres and her federal task force. David waited in a secure location 3 blocks away, protected by federal marshals while preparation teams positioned recording equipment throughout the venue. The guest list read like a directory of Portland's most influential citizens, but I now understood it differently. These weren't just Margaret's social contacts. They were her carefully cultivated network of complicit officials, corrupted professionals, and unwitting enablers who had made decades of murder possible. Judge Patricia Moreau arrived first, resplendent in midnight blue silk that couldn't disguise the nervous energy radiating from her slight frame. Detective Ray Morrison followed shortly after, his dress uniform decorated with commendations that now seemed like mockeries of justice. Dr. Harrison Blake made his entrance with theatrical flair, supposedly having just returned from his European vacation. He worked the room with practiced charm, accepting congratulations on his recent research publication about neurological therapy techniques. Margaret herself arrived fashionably late, dressed in elegant black that seemed appropriate for someone who had spent the week orchestrating her nephew's funeral arrangements. She moved through the crowd with queenly grace, accepting condolences for David's tragic death, while radiating the satisfied confidence of someone whose carefully laid plans had succeeded perfectly. I watched from across the room as Margaret's network gathered around her like moths to flame. Each person in her orbit owed their current position to her strategic support, their careers built on foundations of corruption that she had carefully constructed over decades. The evening's program included the traditional recognition of major donors, presentations of new initiatives, and Margaret's keynote address about the Foundation's expanding mission. What the audience didn't know was that they were attending the final performance of Portland's most successful criminal enterprise. Agent Torres had positioned federal agents throughout the venue, disguised as catering staff, security personnel, and even guests. The operation required precise timing to prevent Margaret's network from coordinating any response or destroying evidence. At 8:30, Margaret took the podium to deliver her annual address. The audience settled into expectant silence as she began speaking about the Foundation's commitment to supporting professionals who served the community with distinction. For over 40 years, the Thornfield Foundation has invested in the careers of exceptional individuals, Margaret announced, her voice carrying easily through the elegant ballroom. We have supported doctors, lawyers, judges, and law enforcement officials who share our commitment to maintaining the highest standards of professional excellence. The irony of her words was staggering. Margaret was literally describing her network of corrupted officials while presenting it as charitable philanthropy. She continued speaking for 20 minutes, highlighting the achievements of Foundation recipients and announcing new scholarship programs. Every person she praised was someone whose professional obligations she had purchased through strategic financial support. As Margaret's speech reached its conclusion, I received a text message from Agent Torres confirming that all federal units were in position. The moment had arrived to reveal the truth about the Thornfield Foundation's real mission. Margaret was acknowledging the evening's special guests when I stood and walked toward the front of the room. Conversations gradually quieted as people noticed my movement, uncertainty rippling through the crowd. "Mrs. Thornfield," I called out, my voice cutting through the elegant murmur of conversation. "Before you conclude this evening's celebration, I believe your guests deserve to know the truth about your recent family tragedy." Margaret's composure faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with remarkable control. "Amanda, how lovely to see you here. I wasn't expecting you so soon after David's terrible accident." The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing tension but not understanding its source. Margaret's supporters exchanged glances, uncertain whether this was a planned part of the evening's program. "Actually," I replied, reaching into my purse for the recording device I had prepared, "David's death wasn't an accident at all. It was a carefully planned murder that you've been orchestrating for months." Gasps echoed through the ballroom as Margaret's facade finally cracked. "That's a horrible accusation," she said, but her voice had lost its confident authority. "You're obviously distraught from grief and not thinking clearly." I activated the recording device, and Margaret's own voice filled the ballroom through the sound system Agent Torres had prepared. "Phase 3 complete. David's body hasn't been recovered yet, but Morrison confirms the lake typically holds victims for extended periods." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers as Dr. Blake's recorded response followed. "The medication regimen achieved exactly the neurological impairment we projected. The timeline from therapeutic swimming to accidental drowning was optimal." Margaret's face went ashen as she realized the implications of her own words being broadcast to the very people she had worked so hard to manipulate. Detective Morrison was backing toward the exit when Agent Torres stepped forward, blocking his path. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Torres announced, displaying her federal credentials, "I'm Special Agent Jennifer Torres with the FBI. This venue is now secured as part of a federal investigation into organized criminal activity." The ballroom descended into chaos as guests realized they were witnessing the exposure of a criminal conspiracy that had operated in plain sight for decades. Some tried to leave, others pulled out their phones to record the scene, and Margaret's inner circle looked around desperately for escape routes that federal agents had already sealed. Margaret made one final attempt to control the narrative. "This is obviously some kind of setup," she declared, her voice rising above the commotion. "David is dead, and his grieving wife is clearly having some kind of breakdown. That was the moment I had been waiting for, the perfect cue for the revelation that would destroy Margaret's credibility forever. The ballroom's main doors opened and David walked in flanked by two federal marshals. The collective gasp from the audience was audible even over the chaos, as Portland's elite witnessed a man supposedly drowned 3 days earlier appearing very much alive. David moved through the crowd with steady determination, his eyes fixed on Margaret with an expression of cold fury. The programming that had controlled him for decades was gone, replaced by the authentic anger of someone who finally understood how thoroughly he had been manipulated. "Hello, Aunt Margaret," David said as he reached the front of the room. "I'm sorry I missed my own funeral planning, but I was busy recovering from the drowning you arranged." Margaret stumbled backward, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "That's impossible," she whispered. "You're supposed to be dead," David finished. "Yes, I know. I read the death certificate you filed before actually killing me. Very thorough planning, but you made one crucial mistake." Margaret's eyes darted around the room, looking for allies who were now backing away from her as quickly as possible. Judge Moreau was already in federal custody, her hands cuffed behind her back as agents read her rights. Dr. Blake tried to blend into the crowd, but federal agents intercepted him before he could reach the exit. His protests about medical confidentiality fell on deaf ears as Agent Torres placed him under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. Detective Morrison's attempt to claim law enforcement immunity was equally futile. The recording of his conversation with Margaret about holding David's body in the lake had eliminated any pretense of innocent involvement. David stepped closer to Margaret, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent ballroom. "You killed my father, didn't you? The hiking accident was just another one of your carefully planned murders." Margaret's remaining composure crumbled completely. "He was going to take you away," she said, her voice breaking with genuine emotion for the first time I had ever witnessed. "Michael wanted to expose the family business, reform everything our grandfather built. He would have destroyed us." The confession hung in the air like a physical presence, recorded by multiple devices and witnessed by hundreds of Portland's most prominent citizens. Margaret had just admitted to murdering her own brother to maintain control of the family fortune. "And you've been conditioning me ever since," David continued relentlessly. "Programming me to be compliant, to never question your decisions, to sign whatever documents you put in front of me." Agent Torres stepped forward with handcuffs as Margaret seemed to deflate before our eyes. The powerful matriarch who had controlled Portland's elite for decades was revealed as nothing more than a serial killer whose schemes had finally been exposed. "Margaret Thornfield," Agent Torres announced formally. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, racketeering, and obstruction of justice." As federal agents led Margaret away, she turned back toward the audience with one final attempt at manipulation. "You all benefited from my support," she called out desperately. "Your careers, your positions, your success, all of it was built on what I provided." The accusation sent a chill through the remaining guests as they realized how completely Margaret had compromised Portland's power structure. Everyone in the room would face scrutiny about their relationships with the Thornfield Foundation and their potential complicity in her crimes. The federal investigation that followed Margaret's arrest uncovered a web of corruption that extended far beyond what I had initially discovered. Her foundation's tax records revealed decades of strategic payments to officials who had consistently ruled in favor of Thornfield interests. Margaret's conviction on 17 federal charges resulted in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Dr. Blake received 25 years for his role in multiple murders disguised as medical accidents. Detective Morrison and Judge Moreau both received significant prison terms and the forfeiture of their pensions. The Thornfield Foundation was dissolved, its assets redirected to legitimate charities that actually served the community rather than corrupting it. David's inheritance, now legally restored, funded a new organization dedicated to investigating unsolved deaths involving wealthy families and their business interests. David's recovery from decades of psychological conditioning proved more challenging than our legal vindication. He spent months in therapy, learning to distinguish between his authentic thoughts and the programmed responses Margaret had installed through years of systematic manipulation. Our marriage required similar reconstruction. The relationship that had begun with genuine affection had been systematically corrupted by Margaret's interference, but underneath the manipulation lay something real worth preserving. We moved to Seattle, far enough from Portland to escape. The constant reminders of Margaret's influence, but close enough for David to testify in the ongoing trials of her remaining associates. David established a consulting practice helping other victims of family financial abuse, while I expanded my forensic accounting work to include cases involving psychological manipulation and coercive control. The death certificate that had started, this entire investigation became the centerpiece of a new legal framework for detecting inheritance fraud. The David Walsh Memorial Act, passed by the Oregon legislature, requires multiple independent verifications for death certificates involving significant financial assets. Margaret's systematic corruption of Portland's institutions led to comprehensive reforms in how the city's professional licensing boards operate. New ethics requirements and financial transparency rules made it much more difficult for wealthy individuals to purchase official complicity. The most satisfying aspect of our victory was watching Margaret's carefully constructed network unravel completely. Officials who had seemed untouchable found themselves facing federal charges, their careers destroyed by their association with her criminal enterprise. 6 months after Margaret's arrest, David and I returned to Portland for the dedication of a memorial garden honoring victims of family financial abuse. The ceremony took place in a park that had previously been named after Margaret's grandfather, the timber baron who had started the family's tradition of treating people as disposable resources. Standing in that garden, surrounded by families who had found justice through our investigation, I reflected on how a single morning and a mysterious death certificate had led to the exposure of Portland's most successful criminal conspiracy. Margaret Thornfield had spent 40 years building what she believed was an unassailable system of power and control. She had corrupted officials, manipulated families, and eliminated anyone who threatened her dominance. But her greatest strength had also been her fatal weakness. The compulsive need to document and control every detail of her schemes had created the evidence trail that ultimately destroyed her. As David spoke to the Memorial Garden audience about the importance of questioning authority and protecting vulnerable family members, I saw the man he had always been beneath Margaret's programming: strong, compassionate, and determined to use his experience to help others avoid similar victimization. The death certificate that had arrived while David was making breakfast had been intended as the final step in his elimination. Instead, it became the first step in his liberation and the catalyst for bringing down one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in Oregon's history. Margaret Thornfield had believed she could control life and death with the same precision she brought to her financial schemes. In the end, she discovered that some things remain beyond the reach of money, manipulation, and murder. Justice, when finally unleashed, proved more powerful than even the most carefully constructed conspiracy. And sometimes, the best way to solve a mystery is to live long enough to tell the truth about it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.